The date is March 4th, 2026. And I think it's safe to say if you've looked at any screen, read any headline, or even just felt that collective kind of suffocating tension in the air today, you know the world is holding its breath right now.
Yeah, it really is.
We are watching a highly volatile, exceptionally dangerous geopolitical crisis unfold in real time. And if you are tuning into this deep dive right now, you're probably feeling a potent mix of intense curiosity and, frankly, a creeping sense of dread.
Right, because you want to understand the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Exactly. But the traditional news cycle is just a relentless fire hose of tactical noise, state propaganda, and sheer panic. It's overwhelming.
It's entirely blinding.
Yeah.
I mean, when the geopolitical tectonic plates shift this violently and this quickly, legacy media really struggles to map the broader strategic picture.
Yeah, they get stuck in the weeds.
Right, we get trapped in the minutia. Which Pacific Air Base was targeted, what payload was dropped, which spokesperson issued which threat. And we completely lose sight of the decades-long cascading ripple effects that actually shape history.
Which is exactly why we are pulling the plug on the breaking news ticker today. For you, the learner listening to this, we're embarking on a very different kind of mission.
A much deeper one.
Yeah. Today's deep dive is an exercise in cold, calculated projection. It's a war game. But our sources for this analysis are not opinion pieces from think tank pundits, and they definitely aren't leaked memos from the Pentagon.
No, our sources are a set of highly distinct, incredibly sophisticated strategic simulations generated by 4 of the most advanced artificial intelligence models on the planet.
We are dissecting raw, synthesized probability matrices from ChatGPT, Claude, Google Gemini, and Grok.
And we fed every single one of these architectures the exact same uncompromising set of current facts. We essentially built a digital sandbox of the Middle East as it stands today.
Right.
We loaded it with current military capabilities, economic dependencies, and political realities, and we just asked them to game out the future, look at 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years out.
So let's lay out the factual baseline we forced them to accept, because the parameters of this simulation are extreme. Here's the foundation all 4 AI models were instructed to treat as undeniable reality.
The starting board.
The starting board, exactly. Point 1. The United States and Israel have launched an open, highly coordinated military campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Which is massive.
Point 2. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been killed in a decapitation strike.
And that is a regime trauma with absolutely no historical precedent since the 1979 revolution.
Point 3. Donald Trump is the U.S. president, meaning he holds the ultimate political responsibility and command authority for this campaign. And finally, point 4. The United States' global reputation and diplomatic capital were already significantly strained before the first missile was even fired.
It's a scenario engineered for maximum pressure. It introduces massive variables into a system that is already notoriously opaque.
But before we dive into the algorithmic logic and the timelines, we really need to establish a very firm boundary for you, the listener. Let's state the impartiality disclaimer clearly.
Yes, absolutely necessary.
Because in a topic this radioactive, the mandate of this deep dive has to be crystal clear.
Right. As geopolitical analysts guiding you through this data today, we are taking absolutely no political sides. None.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the military or diplomatic actions of the United States, Israel, Iran, or any other global player involved in this simulation.
We're not advocating for any political viewpoint. Not left, not right, not center, domestic, or international.
Exactly. Given the nature of the sources, they are analyzing highly politically charged actions. Our job is strictly objective analysis. We are impartially reporting, decoding, and synthesizing what these 4 powerful AI models project will happen based on the data weights they've been trained on.
We are just the messengers of the simulation.
Right. Analyzing the math and the historical patterns they output.
We are looking at the mechanics of statecraft, not the morality of it. Nothing more, nothing less. So here is how we're going to navigate this data over the next hour or so. First, we need to crack open the probability matrix. How do these 4 models mathematically weight the likelihood of entirely different futures?
Which is where the percentages come in.
Exactly. Then we are going to walk through the chronology. We will examine the immediate 1-year outlook in March 2027, the deeper strategic pivot at the 3-year mark in March 2029, and the establishment of a totally new world order in the 5-year outlook by March 2031.
After we map the timeline, we'll strip down the data to see where the AI models are in total eerie lockstep.
And where they radically violently disagree on human behavior. And finally, we'll synthesize all of those conflicting data points into one master most likely outcome.
It really is a phenomenal exercise, precisely because it removes human wishful thinking from the equation.
Yeah.
And AI does not care about election cycles or saving face. It forces us to look at the cold mechanics of macroeconomics, military logistics, and historical precedent.
So let's start with that probability matrix. We are essentially looking at 12 different scenarios. That's 3 primary outcomes generated by each of the 4 models. And they've assigned exact percentage probabilities to each one.
Right.
I want to group these into buckets because when you aggregate the numbers, you start to see how artificial intelligence attempts to quantify the fog of war. Let's look at the largest cluster first.
The largest cluster of probabilities, the scenario that dominates the data across the board, is what we can classify as the long war, or the status quo bucket.
Okay.
This is the timeline where the Iranian regime does not fundamentally collapse under the weight of the strikes, but instead digs its heels in for a protracted, agonizing fight.
I'm looking at the numbers from Claude and Google Gemini right here, and they give this grinding scenario their highest respective probabilities. Claude weights it at 50%, and Gemini pushes it even higher to 55%.
55%.
Yeah. They are envisioning a surviving regime that relies on a war of attrition. But I want to push on that because, the word war usually conjures images of tank columns and defined front lines. That's not what the models are suggesting here, is it?
Not at all.
No.
Gemini actually uses a very specific phrase for this. It calls it Fortress Iran.
Fortress Iran.
The algorithmic logic here is fascinating. You would assume that taking out the supreme leader and inflicting massive infrastructure damage would shatter morale.
Right, that's the conventional wisdom.
But Claude and Gemini's models weigh historical data, specifically the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, very heavily. They calculate that the assassination of Khamenei doesn't cause the system to crumble. Instead, it acts as a martyr-driven catalyst.
A unifying force for the hardliners.
Exactly. The pragmatists and reformers inside the Iranian government are immediately purged or pushed aside, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, seizes total control. They establish a paranoid, hyper-militarized dictatorship.
But they also know they can't win a conventional shootout. I mean, if they send fighter jets up against U.S. F-35s, they just evaporate. So how do they fight a long war if their conventional military is totally outmatched?
They fight by not fighting conventionally. The models calculate a 100% pivot to asymmetric tactics.
Ah, right.
The IRGC activates its entire proxy network across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. They utilize cyber warfare to target Western financial and energy sectors. They deploy cheap, expendable drone swarms to harass shipping.
Because the goal isn't to defeat the U.S. military on a battlefield.
No, the goal is to bleed the U.S. and Israeli economies over a span of years until the domestic political will in Washington collapses.
Now, contrast that specific vision of attrition with the outputs from ChatGPT and Grok. They also park their highest probabilities in this long war bucket, both weighting it at exactly 45%.
Right, so slightly lower than Claude and Gemini, but still their top scenario.
But their interpretation of how that long war functions, and more importantly, how it ends, is distinctly different.
Yes, Grok's data is particularly interesting here. Grok envisions a scenario where the intensity of the conflict burns so hot, so quickly, that it essentially exhausts itself.
Meaning?
It predicts that after anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks of intense, high-casualty exchanges and severe economic disruption, specifically a massive spike in oil prices, both sides are forced into a ceasefire.
A ceasefire.
Yeah. Grok calculates that the economic toll on the U.S. economy forces a diplomatic off-ramp, resulting in a return to something resembling the old JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
Wait, I have to stop you there. A return to a nuclear deal after a decapitation strike and a massive bombing campaign. I am struggling to see how Grok's algorithm makes that leap. How does it justify Iran accepting a new deal after that level of trauma?
It is a controversial projection, absolutely.
Yeah, to say the least.
Grok's logic relies heavily on the assumption of economic rationality. It calculates that the Iranian economy, which is already crippled by years of sanctions, simply cannot sustain a state of total war while also rebuilding its destroyed infrastructure. In Grok's model, survival trumps ideology.
So they take the deal to survive.
Exactly. Iran accepts heavy nuclear restrictions in exchange for immediate, sweeping sanctions relief because the regime desperately needs capital to prevent internal revolt.
What about ChatGPT?
ChatGPT, on the other hand, rejects the idea of a neat diplomatic bow. ChatGPT weights a 45% probability on the conflict freezing. It becomes a permanent, low to medium intensity regional war.
Sure.
No peace treaties are signed, no one official backs down, but the large-scale bombings stop, replaced by decades of shadow warfare.
Okay, so that is the long war bucket, the most statistically likely outcome according to all four systems. But let's look at the second bucket, which we can call regime collapse and chaos. On paper, if you're a military planner executing a decapitation strike, regime change is the ultimate goal. You take out the head, the system falls. But the probabilities the AIs assign to this are surprisingly tight, and their descriptions of the aftermath are incredibly dark.
The consensus on the math here is eerie. Claude calculates a 25% chance of the regime fracturing. ChatGPT is also at exactly 25%.
And Grok.
Grok puts it slightly higher at 30%, and Gemini matches Grok at 30%. So across the board, the AI models assess roughly a 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 chance that the Iranian state actually collapses.
But when you talk about collapse, the models are throwing up massive, glaring red flags about what that change actually entails. The classic Western narrative is that you remove the oppressive leadership, the populace rises up, they hold elections, and a fledgling democracy takes root. Do any of the models assign a high probability to that democratic transition?
None of them. Zero.
Zero.
They universally reject the tidy democratic narrative. When an AI processes the variables of a sudden power vacuum in a highly complex, multi-ethnic state of 90 million people, it doesn't output democracy. It outputs balkanization. Gemini explicitly labels this 30% scenario Syria 2.0.
Define balkanization in this specific context, because we throw that term around a lot in geopolitics.
Yeah.
What does the AI actually mean when it applies that to Iran?
It means the central state loses a monopoly on violence, and the country violently fractures along ethnic, religious, and ideological fault lines.
Okay.
Gemini argues that the power vacuum left by Khamenei and the top IRGC brass doesn't lead to a unified transitional government. Instead, the remnants of the IRGC split into competing heavily armed factions. You have warlords controlling different provinces.
And it breaks apart completely.
You have Kurdish and Baluchi separatist movements making plays for independence. You have Western-backed diaspora groups trying to claim authority in Tehran while having zero actual control over the countryside. It becomes a brutal, multi-sided civil war.
And Claude's logic in this bucket is just as chilling, but it focuses more on the mechanics of regime control. Claude notes that the modern Iranian regime doesn't control its populace through pure religious ideology anymore. It controls them through a massive patronage network and fear.
Exactly. Claude's model calculates that if the command structure is shattered by U.S. strikes, the money that funds the internal security apparatus stops flowing. The mercenaries and local enforcers go home, or they turn into independent criminal syndicates.
That makes sense.
Claude acknowledges that the civilian protest movements in Iran are deeply authentic and homegrown, unlike the exile groups the U.S. relied on in Iraq in 2003. But the model asserts that the sheer scale of the resulting power vacuum makes a peaceful transition mathematically impossible without a massive external stabilizing force.
Which means a multi-decade, multi-trillion-dollar occupation force. And given the political realities of the U.S., particularly under a Trump administration whose brand is America First, the AI calculates the probability of the U.S. providing that stabilizing force at basically zero.
Precisely. You break the state, but you refuse to buy it.
That leaves us with the third and final probability bucket, the outliers and escalation. This is the scenario where escalation management completely fails and the conflict engulfs the entire Middle East.
And the numbers aren't exactly small here.
No, they're not. ChatGPT puts the probability of a total regional war at 30%. Claude and Grok both weight it at 25%. That is a 1 in 4 chance that this localized strike spirals into a conflict that could draw in global superpowers. How do the models map that failure of escalation management?
They map it as a cascading series of emotional and symbolic reactions that override rational statecraft.
So logic goes out the window.
Exactly. The AIs calculate that prestige and survival become intertwined. Iran, feeling an existential threat, decides it has nothing to lose. They launch mass ballistic missile barrages, not just at Israel, but at American bases across the Gulf.
In places like Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE.
Right. Israel responds with broader, unconstrained targeting of Iranian civilian infrastructure. The IRGC makes a desperate play to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. At that point, the U.S. is forced to respond with overwhelming, unconstrained force, drawing neighboring countries into a crossfire they cannot escape.
Before we move off the probability matrix, I have to bring up a massive anomaly in the data. Gemini threw out a scenario that the other three models didn't even rank in their top three. It gave a 15% chance to something it categorized as pragmatic capitulation. What exactly is that?
It is essentially the AI trying to model the psychological variables of the art of the deal.
Oh, interesting.
It's the absolute best-case scenario for the U.S. and Israel. Gemini suggests a 15% probability that the sheer shock and awe of the initial strikes, compounded by the psychological blow of Khamenei's death, shatters the hardliner coalition in Tehran.
So they basically fold.
A faction of pragmatic politicians and moderate military figures realize that total state annihilation is imminent. To save themselves, they launch a quiet internal coup, purge the remaining hardliners, and urgently sue for peace.
And how does the U.S. respond in that 15% scenario? Because Trump wouldn't want to get bogged down in a 20-year occupation either.
Right. Gemini calculates that Trump, wanting to claim a historic, decisive victory without the political baggage of a long war, offers this new pragmatic faction a golden bridge. He gives them a way to formally surrender while dressing it up as a diplomatic compromise.
I see.
They halt the nuclear program, and the U.S. lifts the immediate military pressure.
It's a fascinating variable, but the fact that it only gets a 15% chance from one model and literally 0% from Claude, ChatGPT, and Grok tells you exactly how unlikely artificial intelligence thinks a clean, Hollywood-style diplomatic victory actually is.
Very unlikely.
So let's push the timeline forward. If the probability matrix tells us what might happen, the timeline shows us how it unravels. We are moving into the one-year outlook. Fast forward with us to March 2027. The initial strikes happened a year ago. What does the geopolitical board look like? Let's start with the hard military reality on the ground.
By March 2027, all four models agree on one fundamental tactical reality.
Which is?
The conventional symmetrical war is over, and it was decisively won by the U.S. and Israel.
Tactically won.
Tactically. The air and naval campaigns have been devastatingly effective. Iran's formal military apparatus, its air defense grids, its naval bases along the Gulf, its ballistic missile launch facilities, and its known above-ground nuclear sites, they have been systematically degraded or outright destroyed.
So if the metric for victory is neutralizing large visible military assets, the U.S. claims a massive tactical win in year one. But that is where the victory lap ends, because hitting the Iranian military apparatus is like hitting a massive subterranean beehive with a baseball bat. You smash the physical structure, but now the air is thick with millions of angry, highly dispersed bees. The conventional war is over, but the asymmetric war has violently exploded.
That is a perfect analogy for how the AIs view the structure of the IRGC. And Claude provides a really deep mechanical insight into why this happens.
Let's hear it.
The explicit goal of a decapitation strike is to sever the head from the body, assuming the body will die. But Claude calculates that by killing the supreme leader and the top-tier generals, the U.S. doesn't destroy the IRGC. It aggressively decentralizes it.
Walk me through that. If you take out the generals, shouldn't the captains and lieutenants surrender? I mean, it's standard.
In a traditional Western military hierarchy, perhaps. But the IRGC is designed differently. Claude points out that power immediately shifts to second-generation commanders, the brigadiers and field commanders who run the regional militias and proxy networks.
Ah, the guys on the ground.
Exactly. These are men who have spent their entire careers operating in the shadows in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Suddenly, they are forced to make grand strategic decisions they were never trained for, and crucially, they are operating without any central moderating restraint.
Which means the political calculations of the clerical establishment in Tehran no longer matter. The Ayatollahs historically used the IRGC as a tool, but they kept them on a leash to avoid total war. Now the leash is gone.
Gone entirely. Gemini's model, which we mentioned earlier, flags this as the transition to a purely paranoid military dictatorship. The old regime was a complex, sometimes contradictory balancing act between religious clerics, elected politicians, and the military.
Right.
In the year one reality of March 2027, the clerics and politicians are sidelined. You are left with a stripped-down, hyper-aggressive military junta. Their entire existence is now predicated on zero-sum survival and inflicting maximum pain on the attackers.
So because they can't match F-35s in the sky, they change the battlefield. They unleash the proxy militias. They ramp up cyber attacks on Western infrastructure. And this pivot to asymmetric warfare bleeds directly into the single most terrifying aspect of the one-year outlook.
The global economic shock.
It's massive. We asked these four models to look at the money. Forget the missiles for a second. What happens to the global economy?
The macroeconomic forecasts are grim. Let's start with the most conservative estimate. Grok projects that even in a relatively contained scenario, meaning the war doesn't spill over into neighboring Gulf states, the sheer disruption and fear in the energy markets sends the price of oil to between $90 and $120 a barrel.
Which is painful. It causes a spike in global inflation, the cost of goods goes up, but central banks can arguably manage that over time.
Right. But Claude and Gemini warn of a much darker, highly probable economic cascade. If the decentralized IRGC commanders, acting out of desperation and seeking maximum leverage, decide to seriously threaten the Strait of Hormuz,
The math changes instantly.
it changes everything.
And let's be clear for the listener, we aren't just talking about Iran successfully blocking the strait with sunken ships. They don't even have to do that to cause chaos.
No, they just have to make it uninsurable.
Exactly.
The AI models calculate that if Iran deploys cheap sea mines or launches intermittent $20,000 explosive drones at commercial tankers passing through the choke point, the insurance syndicates at Lloyd's of London will skyrocket the premiums for maritime shipping.
And if you can't insure the cargo, the tankers won't sail.
And if the tankers don't sail, Gemini and Claude predict oil could spike to $150 or even $200 a barrel.
Let's trace the mechanics of a $200 barrel of oil, because the AI isn't just looking at the gas pump. What does that actually do to the global system by March 2027?
It acts as an immediate, brutal tax on the entire global economy. Yes, the price of gasoline in the U.S. doubles or triples, but the AI tracks the secondary and tertiary effects.
The supply chain.
Yes. At $200 a barrel, the cost of diesel skyrockets. That means the cost of transporting every single item on a grocery store shelf jumps. It means the European industrial sector, which is heavily reliant on imported energy, faces mass closures.
And Claude specifically highlights agriculture, right?
Exactly. Claude points to the fertilizer industry. Natural gas and oil are required to produce urea and synthetic fertilizers. If those plants shut down in Europe, global agricultural yields drop. Developing nations in Africa and Southeast Asia face immediate, severe food security crises.
It guarantees a severe, synchronized global recession. Which brings us to the political toll inside the United States. We asked the models to calculate the political capital of President Trump in this scenario. How long can a U.S. president sustain a military campaign that is triggering a global recession?
This is where the intersection of geopolitics and domestic politics becomes the dominant variable. All four AI models ran the political calculus and converged on a strikingly similar timeline. President Trump has a political grace period of roughly 6 to 18 months.
Why that specific window?
Initially in 2026, the models factor in a traditional rally around the flag effect. Furthermore, the isolationist wing of his political base might enthusiastically support a rapid, punitive strike, a show of overwhelming American strength.
Right.
But the AI models project forward to March 2027. If we are 1 year in and a gallon of gas costs $6 or $7, the stock market has shed 20% of its value due to the recession. And the U.S. military is taking continuous, low-level casualties from asymmetric proxy attacks in Iraq and Syria.
The political dynamic violently flips.
Exactly. Grok makes a very astute point here about the specific political psychology of the Trump administration. His brand is explicitly America first. He has historically campaigned against forever wars and foreign entanglements.
So if he is suddenly presiding over a messy, intractable proxy war that is destroying the domestic economy, the pressure from his own base will be immense.
Add to that the friction of a divided Congress. The models calculate a high probability that opposition lawmakers would attempt to invoke the War Powers Act to cut off funding for the military operations.
Creating a constitutional and political pressure cooker in Washington?
Right.
And we have to look at the calendar. March 2027 is precisely when the invisible primary for the 2028 U.S. presidential election begins. The AIs assess that the domestic political pain will force a crisis within the administration. They'll be desperate for an exit narrative, an off-ramp they can sell as a victory, just as the reality on the ground in the Middle East is becoming its most intractable.
Year one is defined by a hollow tactical victory paired with an economic and political nightmare.
So let's move deeper into the timeline. We are entering the 3-year outlook. It is now March 2029. The initial shock and awe have entirely worn off. The global economy has either adjusted or broken, and profound long-term strategic pivots are taking place.
If we examine the midterm projections, the internal picture of Iran itself is incredibly grim, regardless of which probability bucket we are in.
Let's revisit Gemini's balkanization scenario, the 30% chance that the regime collapses. By year 3, the AI models draw direct, terrifying parallels to Libya post-Gaddafi.
Yes, and it's important to explain the mechanics of that balkanization by 2029, because Iran is not a small, homogeneous nation. It is a massive, geographically diverse country of 90 million people.
Right. It's a tapestry of different ethnicities and religious sects held together by the iron fist of Tehran.
Exactly. In a collapse scenario at year 3, the models project that there is no central authority. You might have a Western-backed transitional council sitting in a heavily fortified green zone in Tehran, but their actual authority vanishes the moment you leave the city limits.
They just don't have control.
The provinces are controlled by competing warlords, remnants of the IRGC, and local tribal leaders.
And nature abhors a vacuum. If the U.S. isn't willing to occupy the country, other powers will flood the zone.
They absolutely will. The models project that by 2029, Russia and China are actively backing different regional factions within Iran to secure localized energy contracts and strategic footholds.
While the population suffers.
Massively. The sheer violence of the civil war creates a massive refugee crisis. Millions of people pour across the borders into Turkey, Armenia, Pakistan, and the Gulf states. It creates a demographic and humanitarian catastrophe that destabilizes the entire surrounding region.
But what if we aren't in the collapse scenario? What if we are in that 50% Claude scenario where the IRGC maintains control and digs in for a long war of attrition? Here is where I got actual physical chills reading the AI outputs. There's a terrifying convergence between Claude and ChatGPT regarding the covert nuclear threat by year 3.
This is arguably the most critical strategic failure highlighted in the 3-year outlook. Remember, the explicit primary goal of the initial U.S. and Israeli strikes was to permanently neutralize Iran's nuclear program.
Right, that was the whole point.
And as we discussed in year 1, they succeed in bombing the surface-level facilities. But by 2029, ChatGPT and Claude both calculate that the surviving Iranian regime has made a radical, irreversible strategic shift.
Before the strikes, Iran played a game of nuclear ambiguity. They enriched uranium, they flirted with the threshold, but they technically stayed within certain bounds to leverage sanctions relief. The AIs say that game ends entirely.
It ends completely. The models calculate that after suffering a decapitation strike, the regime no longer cares about civilian nuclear energy, and they certainly do not care about the IAEA or international non-proliferation treaties.
So they sprint for the bomb.
The AIs project that they use the strikes as total justification to sprint toward weaponization. The logic is, we were bombed because we didn't have a bomb. We must get one to survive.
But how do they do that if their facilities were destroyed?
They take it all into the dark. Claude notes that they likely utilized surviving stockpiles of highly enriched uranium that were dispersed before the strikes. They potentially received covert technical assistance from North Korea or Russia.
Oh, wow.
And they build new centrifuge cascades so deep inside the Zagros Mountains that conventional U.S. bunker-busting munitions simply cannot penetrate them.
So the military campaign didn't eliminate the nuclear program.
No, it just pushed it entirely underground, removing any possibility of international monitoring or diplomatic leverage.
And we have to address Claude's ultimate nightmare projection in the alternative scenario. If the central government does shatter and balkanize, what happens to those existing stockpiles of highly enriched uranium?
Claude warns of the loose nuke scenario. It is the absolute worst-case outcome for global security.
Explain that.
You have fissile material and nuclear scientists operating in a country with no central government. The AI calculates a non-zero probability that nuclear material with an unknown destination falls into the hands of an ideological IRGC splinter group, a transnational terrorist organization, or simply a warlord looking to sell it to the highest bidder on the black market.
That is a scenario that breaks traditional deterrence theory completely.
It is the textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. You successfully destroyed the state you viewed as a threat, but in doing so, you unleashed the very weapon you were trying to contain into an untrackable black market.
So, with Iran either balkanized or building deep underground nukes, how does the rest of the world react by 2029? Let's analyze the geopolitical realignment.
The broader region has to adapt to this violent new reality, and the AI models diverge slightly on how that happens. Grok's data suggests a highly pragmatic, fear-driven response from the Gulf states.
What do they do?
It projects that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, terrified by the instability emanating from Iran and deeply concerned that a politically exhausted U.S. is looking to pull back, might formally normalize relations with Israel out of sheer survival necessity.
So an acceleration of the Abraham Accords, but driven by panic rather than peace?
Exactly. They form a defensive security bloc because they realize Washington won't save them.
But Claude and Gemini emphasize a much more profound systemic shift happening inside Iran itself, assuming the regime survives. By 2029, the Iranian economy is sanctioned to absolute death by the West. They are isolated from the European and American financial systems. Who steps in to fill that void? China.
The models project that Iran formally and permanently pivots its entire economic and strategic orientation eastward.
Walk me through the mechanics of that pivot, because China isn't going to just give them money out of charity. What is the transaction?
The transaction is rooted in China's Belt and Road Initiative. The AIs calculate that Beijing steps in to rebuild Iran's shattered infrastructure.
In exchange for what?
In exchange, China demands massively discounted, guaranteed oil exports for decades. And crucially, they secure long-term military and commercial leases on Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
So they get a physical foothold in the Middle East.
Yes. And Russia, meanwhile, acting as the other pole of this new axis, provides the covert military aid. Advanced air defense systems, electronic warfare technology, satellite intelligence, just enough to keep the U.S. bogged down in bleeding resources.
It is a complete strategic realignment. Iran realizes it can never, ever trust the West again, so it legally and economically weds itself to the emerging multipolar bloc. Which brings us perfectly to the final phase of the timeline. Welcome to March 2031, the 5-year outlook, the New World Order.
By 2031, the dust of the initial strikes has long settled, the global economy is recalibrated, and the models reach a profound, almost depressing consensus on the long-term reality. We can call this phase the illusion of victory.
Yeah, this is where the artificial intelligence really strips away the political rhetoric and the press briefings. Regardless of which specific timeline we followed, whether Grok is right and it's a tense cold peace with a weak ceasefire deal, or ChatGPT is right and it's a permanent low-intensity proxy war, or Gemini is right and Iran is a balkanized terror haven, none of the models foresee a stable, pro-Western democracy emerging in Iran.
The probability is calculated at 0%. The grand strategic objective of fundamentally transforming the Middle East into a democratic, pro-American bloc has definitively, mathematically failed. Instead, you are left with a region that is traumatized, heavily armed, highly unstable, and deeply bitter toward Western intervention.
And here's the most striking, perhaps the most important conclusion of this entire deep dive. We need to spend significant time unpacking this because it is a unified, emphatic consensus across all 4 AI architectures.
Unanimous.
We asked the models, in 2031, who actually wins this war? And the answer was unanimous: China.
The China wins consensus is inescapable in the data weights. By 2031, the models calculate that the United States has drained trillions of dollars from its treasury. It has expended immense military resources, depleted its munitions stockpiles, and burned through its diplomatic and political capital both domestically and internationally.
And what has Beijing been doing for those 5 years while the U.S. is fighting?
Beijing has been executing a masterclass in long-term geopolitical judo. They haven't fired a single shot. They haven't committed ground troops. Instead, they emerge on the world stage as the responsible, calm, global peacemaker.
Which is incredibly appealing to the rest of the world at that point.
Exactly. As we mentioned, they've been absorbing massive amounts of Iranian oil at a steep discount, which supercharges their own economic growth while the West deals with inflation. They've secured those strategic deep-water ports in the Persian Gulf, extending their naval reach. But crucially, the AI's project that China locks in absolute strategic dominance in the global South.
Let's drill into that. Why does a U.S. conflict in Iran suddenly cause the global South to pivot to China? Doesn't the U.S. still hold the economic high ground in 2031?
Not in the eyes of the global South. The models analyze the psychology of nations in Africa, South America, and parts of Asia. These countries watched the U.S. launch a unilateral, preemptive war that triggered a global recession, spiked energy prices, and caused food shortages in their own countries.
So they see the U.S. as the destabilizing force.
Right. China points to the wreckage in the Middle East and presents a very compelling counter-narrative. Beijing says to the global South, look at the chaotic, militaristic Americans. They bring instability and sanctions. We, on the other hand, offer infrastructure loans, stable trade, and a strict policy of non-interference in your domestic affairs.
It accelerates a massive generational shift in global power dynamics, which ties directly into Claude's assertion about the death of the Middle East security architecture.
Yes.
For 80 years, basically since the end of World War II, the United States has been the ultimate guarantor of order and maritime security in the Middle East. By year 5 of this simulation, Claude argues that role is permanently finished.
Finished because of exhaustion. The U.S. domestic population absolutely refuses to fund or support another decade of Middle Eastern entanglement. And this power vacuum created by the U.S. pullback accelerates a macroeconomic trend that Gemini heavily highlighted: de-dollarization.
This is a dense concept, but it is critical to understand the 5-year outlook. When we talk about de-dollarization, we need to understand how the U.S. dollar maintains its dominance today. It's tied to its role as a stable global reserve currency and the petrodollar system, where global oil trades are settled in U.S. dollars. How does this war break that system?
The AI models look at how the U.S. utilizes its financial system as a weapon of war. When the U.S. wants to punish Iran or Russia or any adversary, it sanctions their central banks. It cuts them off from SWIFT, which is the global financial messaging system that allows banks to move money across borders.
It essentially excommunicates them from the global economy.
It's a financial nuclear bomb.
Exactly.
But the models calculate that when the U.S. uses that weapon too frequently, and when its military actions threaten global energy supplies, causing that $200 barrel of oil, other nations get spooked. Even nations that aren't enemies of the U.S. start to realize that their entire economic survival is entirely vulnerable to the political whims of Washington.
So, out of self-preservation, they start looking for exits. They start executing bilateral currency swaps, trading oil for goods in local currencies instead of dollars.
Right. China aggressively pushes the adoption of the yuan for energy trades. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, accelerate the creation of alternative payment systems to bypass SWIFT entirely.
By 2031, the AI model suggests that this military campaign against Iran has inadvertently acted as the catalyst that accelerates the decline of U.S. economic hegemony. The dollar is still powerful, but its absolute monopoly is broken.
That's a permanent shift.
So we arrive at the 5-year mark, and the strategic picture for the United States and Israel is arguably worse on a global scale than it was before the first bomb dropped in 2026. This brings us to the penultimate phase of our deep dive. We've thrown a massive amount of data, timelines, and economic theory at you, the listener. We need to distill this down. Let's look at the points of alignment versus the radical disagreements.
Where the models agree and where they fight.
Exactly. Where are these AI systems holding hands, and where are they throwing punches at each other over the algorithmic outputs?
Let's start with the total consensus.
Yeah.
And as analysts, we really need to marvel at this. We're looking at 4 highly distinct AI models. They use different underlying architectures, they were trained by different companies, and they weigh historical data differently.
Right.
Yet they emphatically agree on one core premise. The United States and Israel decisively win the tactical battle, but they unequivocally lose the strategic war.
It's a unanimous verdict. They successfully blow up the targets, they successfully kill the leadership, but the cascading geopolitical fallout creates a net negative security environment.
They also all completely agree that the underlying premise of a decapitation strike, that killing Ayatollah Khamenei will magically unite the Iranian resistance into a cohesive democratic movement, is a fantasy.
As we discussed, they project it either splinters the country into violent chaos, or it hardens the regime into a pure, paranoid military junta under the IRGC.
The moderating elements, the reformers who might have actually engaged with the West, are wiped out in the crossfire, or the subsequent internal purges.
And what is the historical data point they all keep anchoring to? What is the precedent that forces the algorithms to output this pessimistic view?
It is Iraq in 2003. All 4 models cite the invasion of Iraq as the primary historical parallel. They are essentially waving a massive algorithmic red flag. They are calculating the data and screaming, "Do not attempt regime change by force without a comprehensive multi-trillion-dollar, multi-decade plan to manage the vacuum you are creating."
And because the models know that the current U.S. administration is explicitly averse to long-term nation building, they calculate that the vacuum will inevitably be filled by chaos or worse adversaries.
It's a striking, mathematically driven historical warning.
But, as we noted, the models don't agree on everything. There are some radical disagreements in the simulations when they try to predict human behavior and societal breaking points. Let's look at the fate of a collapsed Iran. If the regime does fall, what happens next?
This is where we see the biggest divergence. Gemini gives us that horrific Syria 2.0 scenario we discussed. It models endless, intractable civil war, a fertile breeding ground for entirely new transnational terror groups, and a totally failed state that bleeds instability into Europe and Asia for decades.
But Grok offers a surprisingly different take. It's not exactly optimistic, but it is far less apocalyptic.
Yes, Grok suggests that after maybe 5 brutal years of balkanization and civil war, a Western-backed coalition might actually manage to consolidate power and stabilize a new autocratic government.
Grok posits that Iran could eventually be molded into a new Saudi Arabia. I want to understand that. How does Grok get from a shattered state to a new Saudi Arabia?
Grok's model places a very high weight on the global demand for energy stability. It calculates that the international community, desperate to bring Iranian oil back online securely, will heavily fund whichever strongman or coalition can promise stability.
Ah, I see.
It wouldn't be a perfect democracy. In fact, it would likely be highly repressive, and the population would be deeply traumatized. But strategically, this new government would be aligned with the West, open for business, and fiercely anti-terror. It's a massive divergence from Gemini's projection of permanent civil war.
We also see a radical disagreement regarding the exit strategy in the long war scenario. We touched on this earlier, but let's contrast them directly.
Right, Grok predicts that the sheer economic pain of the conflict will force both Washington and Tehran to the negotiating table, resulting in a new, tense ceasefire akin to a modified JCPOA.
Grok assumes that macroeconomic rationality ultimately prevails because both countries are bleeding capital.
But Claude violently rejects that assumption. Claude's model weighs human psychology and historical grievance much heavier. Claude asserts that after suffering a decapitation strike, the assassination of their leader, and the destruction of their national infrastructure, the Iranian regime will never, ever trust a diplomatic negotiation with the West again.
So for Claude, the paradigm has permanently shifted. There is no going back to Geneva for talks. They will simply endure the economic pain, crush domestic dissent, and integrate completely into the Chinese and Russian spheres of influence.
Exactly. These radical disagreements between the models are fascinating because they highlight the exact variables that are fundamentally impossible to perfectly predict, even for supercomputers.
Yeah.
You cannot flawlessly calculate the breaking point of a civilian population.
Yes.
You cannot predict the exact nature of the charismatic leaders or warlords who emerge in a crisis. You can only assign probabilities to human psychology.
Which brings us to our final challenge for this deep dive. We have explored the probability matrix, we've walked through the timelines year by year, we've unpacked the economic mechanics, and we've debated the contradictions in the data. Now, I am challenging you, as the expert here, to synthesize this.
Okay.
You have to blend all of this conflicting, dense data into one definitive, best guess, master scenario for our listener. If you had to bet everything on the most likely outcome based on all 4 answers, what is the synthesized verdict?
Let's draw the most probable timeline, combining the heaviest data weights across all 4 AI simulations.
All right.
The synthesized master scenario begins with a massive, highly successful tactical military campaign. The United States and Israel successfully degrade Iran's conventional military capabilities and destroy its visible, above-ground nuclear infrastructure in the short term. The decapitation strike against Khamenei is successful.
Tactical win.
However, this tactical success does not trigger a democratic revolution. Instead, the sudden power vacuum triggers a hardline internal takeover. The IRGC, operating now without any clerical restraint or political moderation, institutes a brutal, paranoid military dictatorship.
The shift to the Sumta.
Because they cannot win conventionally, we enter a grinding, highly asymmetrical war of attrition. Iran avoids direct confrontation but unleashes its proxy network across the Middle East. They utilize cyber capabilities to disrupt Western infrastructure, and they launch intermittent, deniable threats to maritime shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
Which triggers the economic shock.
Exactly. This asymmetric campaign causes sustained global economic pain, significantly spiking oil prices and triggering a global recession. Domestically within the United States, the administration faces this global recession, soaring inflation, and mounting slow-drip military casualties.
And the political clock runs out.
Within 18 to 24 months, the U.S. loses the domestic political capital required to sustain a prolonged, expensive regional war. Lacking the political will for a ground occupation, the U.S. essentially declares a tactical victory based on the initial strikes and begins to withdraw its active engagement, shifting to a posture of distant, ineffective containment.
Leaving Iran to survive.
Iran survives, but it survives by transforming into a massive, isolated fortress state. To rebuild its military and survive the crushing Western financial sanctions, Tehran permanently and legally pivots east. It becomes deeply allied with and economically dependent on China, trading its energy reserves for infrastructure. Simultaneously, it receives covert military technology from Russia.
The new axis.
By 2031, the geopolitical map of the Middle East is fundamentally altered. The United States has suffered massive reputational and economic damage, accelerating the de-dollarization of the global economy. China has firmly established itself as the dominant diplomatic and economic power in the region and across the global south.
And the nuclear issue.
Most chillingly, Iran's nuclear program has not been destroyed. It has been driven completely underground, entirely unmonitored by the international community, leaving the world with a vastly more dangerous, nuclear ambiguous, and intensely hostile Middle East.
That is a stark, incredibly sobering synthesis of the data, and it perfectly encapsulates the immense value of this specific kind of deep dive. For you, the learner listening to this is the superpower of looking beyond the breaking news ticker.
Give you the full picture.
Exactly. When the headlines tomorrow are screaming about a successful drone strike or a destroyed bunker or a fiery speech by a politician, you now possess the mental framework to ask the much bigger questions. You can see past the immediate gratification of a tactical strike to understand the decades-long strategic ripple effects.
You understand the economic triggers in the shipping lanes, you understand the geopolitical realignments with China, and you understand the unintended chaotic consequences of creating power vacuums.
It is exactly the difference between looking at a single aggressive chess move and being able to see the entire board 5 turns ahead. The tactical military victory is loud, cinematic, and immediate. But the strategic defeat is quiet, economic, and unfolds slowly over a span of years.
It's a completely different perspective.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for today's deep dive. We want to leave you with a conceptual question to mull over on your own. It builds on everything we've just unpacked from these AI sources, but it asks a larger question about the nature of modern statecraft.
A very necessary question.
Think about this. If 4 independent, highly advanced artificial intelligence simulations, systems capable of processing vast amounts of historical data, complex macroeconomic theory, and intricate military doctrine, all independently arrive at the conclusion that applying overwhelming military force to achieve regime change in this specific scenario results in a net negative strategic outcome for the attacker. Does this suggest a fundamental, permanent shift in global geopolitics?
It raises a profound, deeply uncomfortable question about the actual utility of military force in the 21st century.
Exactly. Does this data suggest that the era of regime change by force, the dominant foreign policy strategy that defined the late 20th and early 21st centuries, is now mathematically obsolete? In a highly connected, multipolar world where economic supply chains are fragile and asymmetric warfare is cheap, is the juice simply no longer worth the squeeze, no matter how technologically advanced or massive your military is?
It's definitely something to consider.
Think about the math. Keep questioning the headlines. We'll see you on the next deep dive.